Yo, what's going on? I got a crazy story time for y'all. The moral of this story is going to be about how skilled labor isn't cheap and cheap labor isn't skilled. So y'all listen up. This was back in early October, late September, something like that. Several months ago, I bought a 2007 Ford F-150 Lariat. Had the nice black vinyl interior. Had about 184,000 miles. This truck was rough though. I paid $3,800 for it. Y'all know how the used car market is crazy, but this was a couple months ago. Anyway, so I paid $3,800. That was the most I've ever paid for a vehicle, believe it or not. But this is roaches to wrenches. We don't pay a whole lot for things. The previous owner hit a pole in the snow, so the whole front end was banged up, but there was no frame damage. So that's why I got it for so cheap. This was a 2007. It was a Super Crew. It was a Lariat, so, top of the line type of trim level, basically, just below the King Ranch. It was a nice truck. When I got the truck, drove away from where it was at, both front struts, the springs were broken, coil springs were broken. Both front calipers were seized because the truck had been sitting for so long. Driver's side front wheel bearing was shot. The ABS light was on. That one wasn't a big deal. I ended up finding a break in the wire where it got frayed. I soldered those back together. ABS light went off, so that was fine. But that was the easiest part. That was no big deal. Back to right after I bought the truck. Time to drive it back home. Mind you, this was 40 miles away from where I was at. So you're talking about a 45-minute drive. Maybe more, like 50 minutes. It was around evening when I picked it up, early evening. I picked up the truck. I started trying to go home. Front calipers were seized. It was still drivable. It's just the brakes were super sticky. It got to a point where I stopped at a stoplight and there was smoke just billowing from the brake calipers, man. I could see it like over the hood of the car. The truck had to work really hard just to get going. I could hear the engine just like, just driving down the road. There was so much resistance. I pulled over into a gas station. I got out, checked the brakes, and you could feel the heat. It was like, wow, like the heat was just radiating from that brake. What am I gonna do? So I ended up just waiting there for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, something like that. So yeah, how else am I gonna get home? So I get back in the truck, start driving, keep driving. At this point, I drive another 5 minutes. I want to say maybe another mile down the road. And the area where I was getting it, you're talking about you got stoplights every couple miles or so. So every time I have to put my foot on the brakes, it sticks the calipers even more. It was getting to the point where the calipers were sticking so bad. Every time I put my foot on the gas to get the truck going, it would do a little burnout before I would even go. That's how bad it was. I mean, the back wheels would start spinning before I would go. Anyway, I ended up pulling into a parking lot. I gave up. I called AAA. I ended up waiting 4 hours for AAA to show up. I'm sure all of y'all know this by now. AAA has changed their policy. They changed it sometime last year, maybe the year before then. I'm not sure. They basically made it ineffective for people who buy non-running vehicles like I do. It basically made AAA useless for people like me. They won't tow a car home if you just bought it that day. They won't tow a car if the registration is out of date, if the tabs are expired, stuff like that. So the tow truck driver shows up. This guy tells me he's not going to tow the truck. I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, yeah, I'm not going to tow it. AAA changed the policy, blah, blah, blah. I was absolutely enraged. He says he could do it, but he would have to charge me $375. I'm like, I'm not paying you $375 to tow a car 35 miles. That's dumb. So at this point, it's almost midnight. I'm exhausted, but I still got to get home. So I get back in the truck and drove home. There was no more traffic. I kept my foot off the brakes as much as possible. Anyway, we make it home. The following weekend, they had this type of all-you-can-carry promo going on at the junkyard. So I end up getting all the parts I can possibly get. I get all those front body panels that were broken from that accident. I got the whole front end, front calipers, struts, wheel bearing, all that stuff. And I still needed more stuff, but they didn't have what I needed at the time. Had to go back later when they didn't have the promo, so I had to pay the full price later. But the whole promo, the all-you-can-carry for like $70 or something, that helped out a lot. I also had a 1.5-inch leveling kit I had lying around for a couple of years. I was actually going to put that on the King Ranch we had a couple of years ago, but ended up just sitting in storage forever. Didn't have a truck I could put it on. I mean, we had that gray F-150 last year, but that one went out of hand. That was the one we had to take the engine and transmission out of, and I just wanted to get that truck over with. So I ended up saying, it's like, you know what? I may as well just put the leveling kit on this truck. It's been sitting in the garage forever. I'll put it on there, see how it looks. It looked all right. Front end was lifted a little bit. It wasn't super level. The front end was a little higher than I would have liked it to be. Maybe a 1-inch leveling kit would have been better, or maybe a 1.5 inch in the front and then maybe a 1 inch in the rear. Whatever. I'll try that another time. So now we finished with the suspension. Now we need to get to the body work and the rust. This truck was a ruster. I wish I had pictures from before. This truck was a ruster, man. I wish I had pictures. I only have the pictures of after I finished everything. The rust was all in the usual spots: cab corners, the back of the rocker panels. You know how it is. But the worst part was the frame rail. When I was doing the suspension work while it was in the garage, I noticed the place where the truck was sitting, there was a little pile of rust. There was a little pile of rust that fell from the truck onto the ground. I didn't think much of it until later. I was doing some work underneath the truck and I saw, oh my goodness, the entire inside of the frame rail on the driver's side was rotted out. Not the entire, like all the way, like a considerable portion of it was rusted out. It was just the inside. The outside of the frame rail was still intact. The passenger side frame rail was fully intact. No rust at all. No rust holes. I definitely almost got in a little over my head with this one, especially with the time frame. I had to fix this truck in 2 weeks. As far as the other rust issues with the truck, the bed, the box was rusted out. It was gone. And the tailgate was no good. It was dented really bad. This truck theoretically had good bones, but it needed a lot of work. I ended up taking the bed off, scrapped that bed. While the bed was off, I ground a lot of that loose scale rust off the frame rails and painted the whole frame with POR 15. Just painted the entire thing. Oh, and before doing that, I went to Lowe's, got a piece of 16 gauge steel, welded that on the inside of the frame rail where it was rusted out. So I got that sorted out. I also dumped a whole ton of oil inside the frame rails, both those frame rails. It's not going to rust out later. Ground the loose scale off the frame rails, painted it all with POR 15. It was good to go. This truck was a little clapped when I started with it, but now it's starting to come around. At this point, the truck runs good, drives good. I sorted the brakes, suspension, everything. Anyway, the box was rusted out, so we had to get another box. I ended up finding one that was less rusted from a salvage yard. It wasn't rust-free, just less rusted. This was back up north where I used to live, and you can't find a rust-free bed up there. And if you do find one, they want $1 million for it. So no rust on the outside. There's like a little bit of bubbling on it, but no big deal. Before we went to get the bed, though, I welded in new cab corners. And since the bed was off, not only was it easier, but I could do a much better job with those cab corners than I've ever done before. It actually looked, even close up, they looked pretty good. Like you couldn't tell they were messed with. Like unless you like really looked, then yeah, you could have seen it. But the cab corners look good. So we get the bed put on. It's time for paint work. The body panels that needed to be painted were the hood, the box, the tailgate, and yeah, that's about it. I found one guy, Mexican dude, really cool dude. His English wasn't all that. Y'all know how it is. He tells me he could do it for $1,500. I actually would have done it, but his time frame, he said he could only be available at the end of that week, and I needed it done straight away because I was in such a time crunch. Like, this was around the time I was moving, so it was like, man. I ended up finding another guy. He seemed like somewhat of a genuine dude. He tells me basically just under $1,000. I'm thinking, man, $1,000, like that's not bad. He tells me he can do it right away, have it done in 2 days. I'm like, 2 days? Like, hell yeah, like, let's start right now. Like, I'll bring it over there right now. The way he's talking, he's saying he has to do all this prep work and stuff like that. I'm like, okay, this guy knows what he's talking about. I get the truck back. At first glance, I'm impressed. I'm happy the truck is all one color. It doesn't look like a clown truck anymore. I later noticed, after getting the truck back home, I walk around it, right? I'm starting to look closely. I'm like, oh my goodness, there are runs everywhere. I went to put the 4x4 decals on the box, and when I went to peel the decal off to apply the sticker, the paint starts coming off with it. And I realized this guy didn't do any prep work. It looked like what he did was just wipe it down with wax and grease remover. Not even adhesion promoter, no scuffs. He didn't even scuff it with Scotch-Brite. No adhesion promoter, no primer, no nothing. This guy totally ripped me off. At this point, I was absolutely livid, but what am I gonna do? It is what it was. That's the lesson for this video. Skilled labor isn't cheap, and cheap labor isn't skilled. Y'all remember that. Anyway, I ended up daily driving that truck for another month, put about 1,000 miles on it. It was a good truck. It was a nice truck. When it was all said and done, I spent $6,500 putting this truck together, including the cost of what I paid for it. At first, I was going to ask $9,000, but I didn't have the title at the time, so I couldn't sell it. And then when I did get the title, it was a situation where like I had to leave that day. So I ended up just selling the truck super cheap. I ended up selling to some guy for $7,000. I was actually happy with the guy I sold the truck to because he was a young cat. You know, he was just starting a construction company, starting to do his thing, young entrepreneur. I always support that. For $500, this truck, the profit I made on that truck was terrible considering the amount of work I put into it. I basically did a restoration on that truck in 2 weeks. 2 freaking weeks. I don't know how many hours I spent over those 2 weeks, but several dozens of hours. But anyway, that's it for this story. Skilled labor isn't cheap. Cheap labor isn't skilled. Y'all remember that. But as always, I'm grinding. I hope you all are doing the same. You all stay strong, stay healthy, and stay inspired. I'm out. God bless.